BYU played who? So who should have won the national championship? Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the game we love each and every day with the best discussion, debate, and analysis. This would fall under the latter. Analysis for the 1984 national championship season, a controversial finish in which BYU was voted national champion. It's understandable in that they were the only undefeated team in the country at 13-0, but let's analyze, as we have looked at 1983 and 1990, in regards to what could have been determined then, how this would have played out during the BCS era, and then also in the current playoff system. Like, comment below. Of course, share the videos on social media, but most importantly, subscribe to Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Turn on that bell for the notifications so you know when we go live, which is just about every day. During the regular season of 1984, BYU swept through the WAC. Yes, you youngsters, the Western Athletic Conference at 12-0. There were basically three main players in the national championship race as we entered postseason play. That was BYU at 12-0. You had Oklahoma, which tied Nebraska for the Big 8 championship. Oklahoma won the tiebreaker, therefore they went to the Orange Bowl with a head-to-head win over the Huskers. Then you had an interesting situation in the Pac-10 at the time, the Pac-10, with Washington winning at 10-1. Although they tied USC, USC lost two non-conference games. So Washington and USC tied for the Pac-10 title. Washington had the better record at 10-1 to 8-3 overall, but USC went to the Rose Bowl because they beat Washington head-to-head. So that was the Huskies' lone loss, 16-7 to USC. So USC, as the Pac-10 tie-breaking champion, went to the Rose Bowl. So that actually set up a situation in which the national championship race could be more clearly defined, because otherwise Washington would have went to the Rose, Oklahoma to the Orange, and BYU to the WAC. BYU pretty much owned the Holiday Bowl at that time, going every year as the WAC champion, going back to the initial Holiday Bowl in 1978. I remember all these games so well going back to 1984. The interesting player here also is Florida. On NCAA probation, the SEC champion did not play in postseason play at 9-1-1. So it's stacked up like this. Regular season BYU 12-0, Oklahoma 9-1-1, and Washington at 10-1. And again, Florida out of play, but we'll bring them back into the mix as an eligible team. So BYU goes to the Holiday Bowl. Who do they play? As the number one team in the country, they play a 6-5 Michigan team. So we're talking about the worst Michigan team going back to the late 60s, and the worst Michigan team we would see until the Rich Rod era in the late 2000s, around 2008, 2009. And this Michigan team would play BYU in the Holiday Bowl. Tie score 17-all. BYU puts together a fairly late drive in the game, about 5 minutes left. They score the game-winning touchdown. Robbie Bosco at quarterback, and they win 24-17. They're undefeated, 13-0. They're in the clubhouse. The Holiday Bowl was played around December 27th. I don't have the exact date, but that was pretty much when the Holiday Bowls were played at that time, just after Christmas. So we had to wait around for 3 or 4 days until the Orange Bowl was played New Year's night, Washington, Oklahoma, because of scheduling, and Oklahoma perceived to have the better team, perceived to have the tougher schedule. It was really Oklahoma was deemed the team as the favorite that would claim the national championship at 10-1-1 if they defeat Washington. But the Huskies won at the Orange Bowl pretty convincingly at 28-17. So what would happen? Let's go back to the regular season. BYU at 12-0 in the regular season. They defeated number 3 Pitt. You would say, bam, there's your marquee win. But that was in week 1. They won that game 20-14. But that was the Pitt program that had Dan Marino the previous season. Marino went to the Dolphins, of course, as a rookie. And that Pitt team started number 3 in the country. They finished, get this, 3-7-1. So wipe out that win as being significant at all. BYU had no ranked wins, including the win over Michigan, a team that finished 6-6 after the Holiday Bowl. Their best wins of the season, over an Air Force team that went 8-4, didn't finish ranked. They won at 30-25. These are also their close wins. They beat a 6-6 Wyoming team 41-38, and they beat a Hawaii team 18-13. The Rainbows finished at 7-4. So BYU didn't beat any ranked teams. They had 3 close calls, actually include the bowl game. They had 4 close calls against pretty marginal, decent teams, like top 40 teams. Okay, that's the BYU resume. The Washington resume is the Huskies finished 11-1 after the Orange Bowl win over Oklahoma. Well, similar to the BYU win over Pitt, week 1, Washington beat a third-ranked Michigan team. Different week, but the early season win over number 3 Michigan, 20-11. Well, that looked like a huge win at the time, but again, Michigan slid to 6-6. Washington, the one loss to USC. They tied for the Pac-12 championship, Pac-10 championship, 16-7 loss there. They did not play the number 2 team in the Pac-10, UCLA, who finished 9-3. So that should have been on the resume, but they did not play UCLA that year. Their best win other than that was against Arizona, 28-12, and the Wildcats were a 7-4 team. So really the marquee win, of course, of the season is Michigan faltered. Arizona wasn't that great, and they did not play UCLA, and they lost to USC. The marquee win for Washington was against Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl 28-17. All right. What I believe should have happened was, despite the undefeated season, Washington should have been named the national champion, having defeated a really top 5 strong Oklahoma team. There's your national championship game, Oklahoma and Washington, despite the one loss for each team. BYU just did not have the resume, in my opinion. Okay, in the BCS formula, BYU would have been wiped out. That schedule would not have factored into the BCS formula. You would have had a clear-cut national championship game between Oklahoma and Washington. All right, now if Florida was eligible, okay, Oklahoma's resume going into postseason play was 9-1-1. They tied a Texas team that was number 1 in the country mid-season that faltered later with 3 losses. They defeated the number 1 team in the country, Nebraska, the final week of the season, and that was the second to last weekend of the season. Then they turned around and beat number 3 Oklahoma State. So Oklahoma played, at the time of the game, 2 number 1s and a number 3, and they tied one of those games and picked up 2 other wins. They had a interesting, odd loss to Kansas, a 5-6 Kansas team, 28-11. So that was Oklahoma's resume. Throw in Florida. Florida with wins over number 11 Auburn, number 8 Georgia. They beat a 9-3 Kentucky team that finished in the top 25, and they beat a team, Florida State, that was 12th ranked at the time of the game. And Florida State still finished in the top 25. Florida's loss was to Miami in week 1, 32-20. So, make Florida eligible in your national championship game despite having the tie each for Oklahoma and for Florida based on strength of schedule would have been Oklahoma, Florida. So there's your national championship game in the BCS era. It would have been Oklahoma, Washington, but if you make Florida eligible, it would have been Oklahoma, Florida. And the Gators win that game. All right, let's get to the college football playoff era. I'm going to make a close call here and say Florida would have been number 1 based on their schedule at 9-1-1. And again, you got to make them eligible. Oklahoma number 2, 9-1-1. Washington 3, 10-1. And BYU would have, despite the group of 5 status, because we've got a glut of 2-loss teams. So the comparison would have been BYU against, this is interesting, South Carolina, not in a conference, an independent, but not given a whole lot of play at that point, not a whole lot of respect for the Gamecocks based on their schedule at 10-1. Then you had Oklahoma State at 9-2 in the top 5 in the country. You had Nebraska at 9-2. That was number 1 before losing to Oklahoma late, and you had the Big Ten champion Ohio State at 9-2. So you would have had, and also a Boston College team with Doug Flutie that pulled off the miracle against Miami on Thanksgiving weekend, 9-2. A glut of 9-2 teams to compare to BYU at 12-0 for that last college football playoff spot. I believe BYU would have snuck in. If anybody was going to make it out of those other teams, it would have been, I think, the conference champion, Ohio State, 9-2 out of the Big Ten. So you've got Florida, Oklahoma, Washington, BYU in the playoff. Florida beats BYU, the 1-4 game. Oklahoma, now I'm going to go with Washington. They did win the head-to-head matchup against Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl that was actually played. So you've got a national championship game under the playoff era of Washington and Florida. Gators win at 27-20. There we go. Our look at 1984. BYU awarded a national championship despite not beating a ranked team as the only undefeated team in college football at 13-0. I would have awarded reluctantly had I been put in that situation of only being able to award it, not being able to expand it to a playoff, just award it based on the vote. I would have handed the national championship to Washington based on the good wins against Oklahoma in particular at 11-1. Again, your BCS game would have been Washington-Oklahoma unless Florida was eligible. And then your college football playoff with Florida eligible is Florida, Washington, Oklahoma, and BYU in the playoff. And we believe the Gators would have won the national championship in 1984. Comments below, folks. And of course, subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications. That way you know when we go live almost every day. Content posted each and every day right here at the Voice of College Football.